The afternoon moved the way it always did in that place, steady and loud, filled with people who were all going somewhere else. Shoes tapped against the floor in different rhythms. Wheels from suitcases rattled and hummed. Voices floated in pieces, half sentences, quick laughs, tired sighs. Above it all, a wide glass ceiling let pale daylight spill down, giving everything a soft shine that made the space feel open even when it was crowded. Near the center of the hall stood a piano. It wasn't new. The black paint along its edges was chipped, and the keys showed signs of long use. Some were slightly yellowed, others scratched. A small sign rested on top, worn at the corners, with simple words inviting anyone to sit and play. Most people barely noticed it anymore. It had become part of the background, like a bench or a pillar, something that had always been there. From time to time, someone would stop and press a few keys. A child might bang on it while a parent apologized and pulled them away. A teenager might play a short tune, smiling nervously if people looked. A street performer might sit longer, hoping for attention, but usually leaving after a few minutes when the crowd didn't grow. The piano waited patiently between those moments. Not far from it stood a man who didn't look like he belonged to any story worth telling. He wore a plain jacket, slightly faded, and simple shoes that had been cleaned but clearly used. His hair was neat but unstyled, touched with gray at the sides. His face carried the lines of age and experience, though nothing about him stood out enough to make people stare. He stood still while the world moved around. Him, people brushed past without looking. A woman hurried by while speaking into her phone. Two friends laughed as they checked something on a screen. A worker leaned against a column, scrolling, eyes tired. The man noticed all of it, but he didn't hurry. He had nowhere he needed to be at that moment. His gaze kept drifting back to the piano. He didn't walk straight toward it. Instead, he stayed where he was, as if unsure whether he had the right to approach. His hands rested loosely at his sides. Every now and then, his fingers twitched, almost without him noticing, as if remembering something old. Years ago, many years ago, his hands had known those keys well. Back then, music had been simple. It hadn't been about skill or praise. It had been about release. About sitting alone in a quiet room after a long day, letting sound say what words couldn't. He hadn't been rich then. He hadn't been powerful. He had been free in ways he didn't understand until much later. A loud announcement echoed through the hall, pulling him back into the present. People shifted direction, adjusting their paths. The noise rose and fell like a living thing. Still, the piano stood calm, untouched for the moment. A young man walked up and played a few fast notes, trying to impress someone nearby. The tune fell apart halfway through. He laughed it off and walked away, cheeks red. The piano was quiet again. The man watched all of this with a distant look, his eyes carrying a mix of interest and something heavier. He wasn't thinking about who he was supposed to be. He wasn't thinking about meetings, numbers, or decisions that affected thousands of people. For once, none of that pressed against his chest. Here was just another face in a crowd. No one around him knew that his name appeared in articles and business reports. No one knew that his choices moved money, shaped companies, and influenced lives far beyond this place. He liked it that way. Anonymity felt rare and valuable, like a deep breath after holding it too long. He had dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that wouldn't attract attention. He had left behind the watch people recognized, the polished shoes, the quiet signs of status. Today was meant to be simple. Just walking, just watching, just being present in a space where no one expected anything from him. The piano challenged that. Plan. A small child tugged at their parent's hand and pointed toward the keys, eyes wide with curiosity. The parents smiled but shook their head, urging the child along. The moment passed, but the image stayed with the man. He remembered being that child once, standing on tiptoe to reach keys that felt impossibly far apart. He shifted his weight and took a step forward without fully deciding to. Then he stopped again. Doubt crept in quietly. What if his hands no longer remembered? What if he embarrassed himself? What if someone filmed it and turned a private moment into something public? He glanced around. Most people were still rushing. A few stood nearby, resting or waiting, not really paying attention. This wasn't a stage. It was just a corner of everyday life that made it harder. Somehow, the piano wasn't asking for perfection. It wasn't asking for proof of talent. It was simply there, open, offering sound to anyone brave enough to try. The man took another step, then another. Each one felt heavier than it should have. His heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with something closer to anticipation. A feeling he hadn't felt in years. As he approached, he noticed more details: the faint marks on the wood, the way the bench leaned slightly to one side, the soft reflection of light on the lid. He could almost smell the familiar scent of old instruments, a mix of dust and polish and time. Someone brushed past him and glanced at the piano, then at him, then kept walking. To them, he was just another passerby considering whether to sit. He paused right beside the bench. For a long second, he didn't move. The noise of the hall pressed in on him again. The announcements, the footsteps, the voices. He wondered if this place was too loud, too exposed. He wondered if he should turn back, leave the piano for someone younger, someone braver. Then he thought of how many times in his life he had walked away from things that mattered because they didn't fit into a schedule or a plan. He exhaled slowly. Sitting down felt like crossing a quiet line. The bench creaked softly under his weight. He adjusted his position, careful and respectful, like someone entering a space that still held meaning. His feet settled on the floor, solid and grounded. For a moment, he just sat there. People began to notice, not because he looked important, but because someone had finally claimed the empty piano. A few slowed their steps. A couple of heads turned. Nothing dramatic, just mild curiosity. He lifted his hands and hovered them above the keys. They trembled slightly. That surprised him. He had stood in front of rooms filled with powerful people without shaking. He had signed papers worth more money than most could imagine with a steady hand. Yet here, in front of strangers who didn't know his name, his fingers felt unsure. The keys waited. He placed his fingers down gently, not pressing yet, just feeling the cool surface beneath his skin. The sensation sent a quiet rush through him, like touching something lost and found again. His shoulders loosened without him noticing. Somewhere deep inside, muscle memory stirred. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look around at all. He looked only at the keys, at the familiar pattern of black and white. He remembered learning where to place his hands, remembered being corrected, remembered practicing late at night when the world felt too big. A woman standing nearby slowed and stopped. A worker leaned back against a wall, arms crossed, watching with mild interest. A man checking his phone paused, glancing up. The space around the piano grew just a little quieter. Not because the noise stopped, but because attention shifted. Still, no sound came from the keys. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He wasn't thinking about being seen. He was thinking about the first time music had made him feel understood. He was thinking about the long path that had carried him far away from that, feeling his fingers press down. The first note rang out, soft but clear, cutting gently through the noise of the hall. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed. A few people looked up more fully now. He lifted his finger and pressed another key, then another, slowly forming the beginning of something familiar. The tune was simple, almost shy, like a conversation starting quietly. His hands moved carefully, as if testing whether they were welcome. The sound felt real in a way few things in his life did anymore. As the notes continued, something shifted inside him. The tension he carried every day, the constant weight of responsibility, eased just a little. The piano didn't care who he was. It didn't care about success or failure. It responded only to touch, to honesty. Around him, the world kept moving, but differently now. People still walked, still talked, still hurried, but some stayed. Some listened. Not because they knew what was coming, but because they felt something genuine beginning to form. The man kept playing. unaware of how this small choice, this single moment was about to change the afternoon for everyone within earshot, and he had no idea how deeply it would change him too. The man's fingers moved slowly over the piano keys. At first uncertain, almost timid, each note sounded like a memory waking up after a long sleep. He remembered the way his hands used to feel in his youth, strong, confident, fluid. That feeling had faded over the years. Life had a way of taking the parts of you that were soft and quiet, the things that mattered only to yourself, and burying them beneath the weight of duty and expectation. But here now at this piano, something of that feeling returned. He wasn't playing for anyone. Not for the small crowd that had gathered, nor for the curious glances of the passers-by. He was playing for himself, for the man he used to be, for the part of him that had loved music before it became a memory. And as his fingers pressed the keys, the sound was gentle at first, hesitant. Each note carried a piece of history, small, private victories and quiet disappointments. He remembered the first time he had touched a piano. He had been a child, maybe no older than 8, small and restless, full of energy that had nowhere to go. His parents had noticed that he liked the sounds things made, the way music could shift the air in a room. On a rainy afternoon, when he couldn't go outside, his mother had taken him to a neighbor's house that had a piano. At first, he had tapped randomly, hitting wrong keys, unsure of what to do. But soon, he had found the rhythm in his fingers. He had discovered that even by pressing the right combination of keys, he could make the air vibrate and change the feeling in a room. That simple power had stayed with him. Years passed. The piano became a private companion, a place where he could retreat. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he would sit and play by memory, exploring melodies that came from his heart rather than any sheet music. Music had been his sanctuary, the one place where nothing else mattered, neither wealth, nor expectation, nor responsibility. But then life had taken him away. Work, ambition, and the relentless pace of success had demanded his time and attention. Meetings replaced melodies. Contracts replaced chords. He had built a life that people admired, that newspapers and magazines praised, that boardrooms and shareholders relied upon. Yet in the quiet corners of his mind, the memory of music never left him. It waited, like a patient friend, knowing that someday he might return, and now he had returned. As he played, he felt something stirring within him. The music was no longer just sound. It was emotion, memory, and release all at once. Every note was a thread connecting him to the boy who had discovered joy in simple patterns of black and white. The adult he had become, the man known in the world for wealth and influence, felt smaller here, stripped of expectation. Only the man who had loved music remained. He noticed the people around him more clearly now. There were several who had stopped walking, standing a few feet away to listen. Some faces were neutral, but others carried curiosity, a spark of surprise. A young couple stood together, their hands brushing, eyes fixed on the piano. A woman with a stroller had paused, the baby reaching toward the sound with tiny fingers. Even a man in a business suit had stopped mid-step, the briefest flicker of attention breaking his hurried expression. None of them knew who he was. To them, he was just a stranger who had decided to sit at a public piano and play. That anonymity felt freeing. He did not have to be anyone here but himself. The man who had been judged, analyzed, and admired by strangers in the past could simply exist. His notes did not have to impress. His fingers did not have to move perfectly. He was allowed to be imperfect and human. As he played, fragments of the past came back to him in waves. He remembered his first recital, sitting on a stage far from home, hands trembling, trying to remember the piece he had practiced for months. The applause had been loud, enthusiastic, and yet distant. The feeling of being seen, of performing, had never felt as real as the moments when he was alone with music. That lesson had stayed with him. Recognition could be fleeting, but the act itself, playing, expressing, was permanent, timeless. The man's breathing slowed as he became more absorbed. The piano had a voice that he had almost forgotten. Each key responded to him as if it recognized him after years apart. There was no need for grand gestures or complex chords. Simple patterns, Small sequences of notes were enough. They filled the hall in a soft, gentle wave. Cutting through the background, noise of footsteps and distant chatter, he played a melody that had been with him since childhood. One that had no name, one that had never been recorded. It was a tune of quiet longing and hope, the kind that makes people remember moments they cannot explain. The notes hung in the air, and for a few minutes, the world outside the piano ceased to matter. He thought about the people who might be listening. Most would not know what they were hearing, just that it was unusual, soft, and emotional. Some might feel a chill or a sudden tug at the heart. A few might stop completely, their daily worries momentarily replaced by something that mattered more. That thought made him smile slightly. Music had a quiet power, more than any contract or boardroom decision. It could reach people in ways the world rarely allowed. The memory of a loss touched him as he played. He had once loved someone deeply, someone who had understood the rhythm of his life in ways few others had. Music had been a language between them, private and sacred. Life had moved on. Responsibilities had taken him away, and eventually they had drifted apart. But now, sitting here, he felt close to that part of himself again. The piano allowed him to speak without words, to connect to the feelings that had been buried under years of expectation. His hands moved faster now, with more certainty. The notes flowed into a simple melody, gentle but expressive. The rhythm was steady, almost like a heartbeat. The crowd had grown slightly, people drawn in without realizing why. They weren't here for a show. They were here because something in the music touched them. Some stopped entirely, others slowed, but all were affected, whether they admitted it or not. One elderly woman paused near the edge of the small gathering. She leaned slightly on her cane but kept her eyes on the man at the piano. There was something familiar in the way he played, something that reminded her of a long-past life, of memories she hadn't thought about in years. She didn't speak, didn't clap, didn't move. She simply listened. And that silence, as much as the music itself, seemed to fill the hall with something profound. The man kept playing, unaware of the growing attention. He was not thinking about recognition or applause. Every note, every movement of his fingers was a conversation with the past and present at once. He thought about the long hours he had spent building a career, the decisions that had affected thousands of people, the meetings that had left him drained, and the moments when he had felt alone despite being surrounded by others. This music reminded him that beneath all that, he was still human, still capable of feeling deeply. The piano allowed him to forget the world outside for a while. Each chord he struck reminded him that life was more than power or success. Life was moments, fleeting and fragile, that needed to be noticed. A small crowd, a public space, an old piano, they all became part of something larger. A reminder that beauty could exist in unexpected places. A young boy stood nearby, holding his mother's hand. His eyes were wide, watching every movement. He did not understand why the music made his chest feel warm, but he felt it nonetheless. His mother smiled softly, noticing the child's fascination. For a few minutes they were both transported beyond the rush of their daily routine, carried into a moment that felt special and rare. The man at the piano was beginning to feel something he had not felt in decades, a quiet sense of connection. Not to fame or fortune, but to people. Strangers? Yes, but real humans. Feeling something real together, bound for a few minutes by the sound of music alone. It was a gift he had almost forgotten he could give himself and others. He slowed the tempo slightly, letting each note linger, stretching the space between them just enough to allow reflection. The echoes of the keys seemed to fill not just the hall, but a small, invisible space in the hearts of those listening. It was unspoken, subtle, and intimate, and then he remembered why he had left music for so long. The world had demanded a different kind of attention, one that left little room for the quiet joy of playing. Yet here he was, reclaiming a part of himself that had never truly left. It was not about proving anything. It was about being present fully in a moment that was his own. As he continued to play, the crowd shifted subtly. People who had been passing by now lingered. Phones were lowered. Conversations paused. The music was not loud, but it was impossible to ignore. Even those who didn't stop felt it touch something inside them, a reminder that life could still surprise, still inspire, still move the soul in simple, unexpected ways. The man at the piano was fully immersed. His past and present collided gently, creating a space where he could breathe freely. Each note carried history. Each pause held memory. He had returned to a part of himself that had been waiting patiently, a part of him that could still feel joy, sadness, hope, and connection. And in that hall, amid the noise of footsteps, voices, and announcements, the piano spoke louder than anything else. The man's fingers no longer trembled. They moved over the keys with quiet confidence, as if remembering a language he had almost forgotten. Each note carried more than sound, it carried memory, emotion, and a sense of presence that filled the hall. The crowd had grown slightly, though not with people seeking entertainment. They were drawn in by something more subtle, the honesty of someone fully engaged in a moment. Not performing, not showing off, just being. He began to play a melody that rose and fell gently, like a story told without words. The notes weren't complicated or flashy, but they held weight. They held feeling. Each chord seemed to stretch further into the hall, touching corners that had gone unnoticed, brushing against the ears and hearts of those passing by. People slowed down, unconsciously shifting their steps to listen. Some turned their heads fully, drawn as if by gravity. The world around them continued, but in that small space near the piano, time had softened. A young woman leaned against a railing, resting her chin on her hand. She had been tired, moving mechanically through her afternoon, thinking about tasks she still had to complete. But now, her focus had shifted. The music didn't demand her attention. It offered her something to notice. She let herself feel a small tug at her chest, a recognition that life had beauty, even in quiet, unexpected moments. Nearby, a man carrying a briefcase stopped in his tracks. He had been running from meeting to meeting, calculating, planning, ticking off obligations. For a moment, he forgot his schedule, forgot the pressure that usually pressed against him. He simply listened. His eyes softened, and he realized he hadn't felt this relaxed or quiet in years. The pianist himself was unaware of the effect he was having. His mind was elsewhere, caught in the music itself. He played as if he were speaking to an old friend, one who had waited patiently for him to return. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful. There was no rush, no need for speed or complexity. The music was not meant to impress anyone, it was meant to connect, to remember, and to heal. He remembered the hours he had spent as a child, alone at a piano in a quiet room, feeling that music could speak when words could not. He remembered the first time he had composed a simple tune, not for anyone else, but for himself. That sense of creation had been powerful, a way to touch life without speaking. Over the years, the world had demanded he put that energy elsewhere. Decisions, strategies, power, money, these had filled his days. Music had been pushed aside, almost forgotten, except for fleeting memories in the back of his mind. Now, each chord felt like a gentle reclamation of something lost. The melody carried not only the sound he played, but the silence he had lived through, the moments he had ignored, and the quiet longing that had always been inside him. A little girl had stopped near the edge of the crowd, holding tightly to her mother's hand. She tilted her head, listening with wide eyes, absorbing the notes as if they were magic. Her small body seemed to still completely, as though nothing else mattered. The mother smiled, noticing her daughter's fascination. She too felt a small warmth inside, an unexpected reminder that simple moments could still hold wonder. The man at the piano became aware of the crowd in a soft, distant way. He saw their faces, their curiosity, their attention, but he did not let it affect his playing. It was not performance. It was conversation. The music moved between him and the listeners, threading through the space invisibly. No one spoke. No one clapped. Yet the air was full of connection. Strangers were sharing a feeling they could not name, all because of a few dozen keys, pressed by a man who had no claim to fame in that moment. A slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He had spent so much of his life chasing recognition, moving through spaces where his presence was known and measured. But here, he was unknown, unmeasured, and free. The anonymity was part of the magic. The people listening did not know him, and that allowed him to be fully himself. The notes began to climb, moving higher on the scale, carrying a lightness that contrasted the gentle melancholy of the earlier chords. His hands flew with a quiet precision, creating a sound that felt both youthful and experienced, simple yet full. Every press of a key was deliberate, every pause a breath. The melody became a story, not of events, but of feeling. He thought of the people who might be watching him. Some of them would feel the emotion clearly, some only vaguely, but it did not matter. The music was for everyone, and no one at the same time. It existed independently of them, yet touched them in ways words never could. A small crowd had now gathered. Some were standing casually, some leaning, some holding phones, but not yet recording, unsure if they should. The music was not loud or showy. It did not demand attention, but it had captured it anyway. The man's mind wandered briefly to the concept of legacy. In his life, he had left marks that were measured in contracts, companies, and influence. They were visible and significant, yet impersonal. The music he played now reminded him of another kind of legacy, the kind that quietly changes moments, touches hearts, and leaves a subtle imprint. It was invisible in reports or headlines, but it lingered nonetheless. He paused for a moment, letting the notes hang in the air. The silence was not empty. It was full of attention, full of hearts noticing, listening, absorbing. The pause was gentle, reflective. A small bridge before the melody continued. Then he began again, softer at first, then building steadily. The music became richer, more expressive, carrying joy, longing, hope, and a touch of sadness. It was a melody that seemed to exist somewhere between memory and presence. He was not performing. He was feeling, and that feeling carried through the keys, through the air, into the hearts of everyone nearby. An elderly man stood near the edge of the gathering. He had seen the world change in ways he had never anticipated. He had lost friends, celebrated successes, endured disappointments, and carried quiet regrets. Yet here, in this unremarkable hall, he felt a spark of something he had not felt in years. The music reminded him of days long gone, of afternoons filled with music and laughter, of moments of quiet reflection. He closed his eyes and let himself remember. The pianist noticed the subtle reactions, not consciously, but in a way that made him smile inside. Each person was responding in their own way, yet all were part of the same moment. The piano had a way of connecting them without a single word. It was not performance. It was communion. He thought briefly about his own life. The choices he had made, the people he had met, the paths he had taken, they had all led him here, to this piano at this time, in this space. For years he had sought control, power, recognition, and validation. Yet here, he felt a freedom he had rarely experienced. He felt present, alive, and connected. The music began to change again, moving into a softer, slower section. The notes were lighter, almost fragile, as if testing the air, reaching for something intangible. He thought of the moments he had missed, the people he had lost, and the emotions he had ignored. The melody became an apology to himself, a gentle acknowledgement of what had been, and what could still be. A young man, standing with a coffee in his hand, shifted closer, captivated. He did not understand why the music stirred something inside him, but it did. The simple sequence of notes seemed to bypass thought and go straight to feeling. He could feel the subtle highs and lows of the pianist's emotions, and it moved him unexpectedly. The man at the piano continued, letting the melody flow naturally. He no longer cared about mistakes, about imperfect timing, about how it sounded to anyone else. The music was his expression, his story, and it demanded honesty above all else. The hall, the crowd, the people all became part of the experience. Yet the experience belonged solely to him. The notes rose in volume slightly, carrying with them a sense of anticipation and hope. There was a forward motion, a gentle drive that seemed to invite the listeners along, leading them without force, simply by the pull of sound. The crowd shifted subtly, leaning in, sensing the change, feeling it too. A mother, holding her child close, felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been thinking about worries, errands, schedules, and distractions, yet in this moment, none of that mattered. The music reminded her of quiet evenings long ago, of lullabies sung softly, of a simpler time when life's pressures had not yet built their walls. The pianist was unaware of each individual reaction. He was unaware of the ripple he was creating. He was lost in the music, fully immersed, letting the notes carry him where they wanted. His hands moved instinctively, guided by memory, emotion, and intuition. The crowd did not know his story, but they could feel its echo in the melody. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes passed unnoticed. The piano, the man, and the audience became a single entity, bound together by sound and feeling. The music was no longer just a series of notes. It was an expression of life itself, quiet and patient, yet immensely powerful. And then he began to slow, allowing each note to linger just a little longer, giving space for reflection, for breath, for understanding. The melody softened, drifting gently toward its close. The hall was full of stillness, full of hearts listening, full of quiet wonder. The man at the piano realized something in that moment. The music was not about performance. It was about presence, connection, and honesty. It was about reaching people in ways that words often could not. And it was about reclaiming a part of himself he had long neglected. The hall had fallen into a quiet stillness. Footsteps no longer echoed loudly. Conversations had paused, replaced by a single, shared focus on the piano and the man who played it. The melody he had begun was no longer just music. It had become a bridge between strangers, a gentle thread weaving them into the same moment. He leaned slightly closer to the keys, as if speaking directly through each note. His fingers pressed down with purpose, not force, letting the piano respond to each subtle intention. The melody began to deepen, grow richer, as if it had sensed the weight of the room. The notes carried emotion in their curves and pauses. The way a sigh carries meaning without words. His mind wandered briefly to the losses he had endured over the years, the people he had loved and lost, the choices he had made that led him further from himself. The music became a reflection of that journey, quiet reckoning with the moments he had ignored, the regrets he had carried, the longing he had kept hidden. He could feel the shift around him. The audience, though small, had become still in a way that made the space feel sacred. A mother held her child closer, sensing the weight behind the notes. The young woman leaning against the railing felt her breath catch, as if the music had pulled her into a memory she hadn't thought about in years. Even the hurried businessman seemed smaller, softened by something he could not name. As though the sound had reached a part of him he rarely allowed to exist. The man's hands moved faster now, yet not in a frantic way. Each chord carried more than sound, it carried life, a mixture of sorrow and hope, memory and presence. The melody rose and fell like a wave, gentle at times, powerful at others. The notes seemed to spill out of the piano and into the air, filling corners of the hall that had felt empty just moments ago. He remembered a time long ago, before the weight of responsibility had taken over his days, when music had been his refuge. He had spent hours alone at the piano, letting each note tell a story, letting silence between the notes speak louder than anything else. Those hours had been sacred yet fleeting. Life had pulled him away, leaving only fragments of memory behind. Now, as he played, he felt those fragments reconnecting. The music allowed him to face those moments, not with pain, but with understanding. Each note was a reminder of what he had lost and what he still had the ability to feel, to connect, to touch others without words. A soft murmur passed through the crowd, almost imperceptible. Eyes met briefly, as strangers recognized the shared experience. There were no introductions, no explanations, just acknowledgement. Something unspoken had shifted. The music had reached them, threading through their hearts and memories. Pulling them into the same space, he leaned into the piano slightly, letting a low, resonant chord ring out fully. The sound seemed to linger longer than normal, vibrating in the air, settling into the quiet corners of the hall. It was as if the notes themselves carried weight, bending the space around him, softening it, making it more receptive to the emotion he poured into them. His thoughts drifted to a person he had once loved deeply, someone who had understood him in ways no one else ever could. They had shared quiet afternoons filled with music, conversations that were never spoken aloud but felt in the chords and harmonies they created together. Life had taken them apart, and years had passed without a word. But in this music, he felt a connection again, fleeting yet real, as if she were listening somewhere beyond the boundaries of the hall. The melody became more complex, yet not overwhelming. It carried contrast, soft moments of reflection followed by rises that hinted at joy and release. The music moved naturally, as if it had a mind of its own, guided only by the emotion in his fingers and the memory in his heart. A few people began to react more visibly. A young boy's eyes filled with tears, uncomprehending but moved nonetheless. His mother brushed his hair back gently, her own eyes misting. An elderly man clasped his hands together, leaning slightly forward, feeling the pulse of the melody as if it had awakened something dormant inside him. Even the people who had not stopped entirely seemed lighter. Their movements slowed, their expressions softened. The pianist felt a shift within himself as well. He realized he was no longer just recalling memories or playing melodies, he was sharing them. Every note carried part of his story, and every pause allowed others to absorb it, to interpret it, to feel it in their own way. The experience had become communal, yet profoundly personal for each listener. He pressed down a series of chords that felt heavier, more urgent. They were not loud, not aggressive, but they carried the weight of accumulated emotion. It's a sum of quiet years and unspoken thoughts. The sound resonated in the hall, shaking the air, touching the skin and hearts of those around him. Some eyes glistened with tears. Some chests rose and fell more deeply, as if the music had reminded them to breathe. The man noticed nothing of the audience. He was lost entirely in the flow, in the conversation between himself and the piano. It was no longer about who was listening or what they might think. It was about honesty, about expression, about letting the sound reveal what words could not. A subtle change came to the melody. The notes slowed, softened, became almost fragile. They lingered, shaking slightly, as if uncertain, carrying a sense of vulnerability. This was the part of the music that reflected fear, regret, and longing. The pianist allowed it to hang, letting it settle into the air. A woman standing nearby brought a hand to her mouth, blinking rapidly. She was not crying loudly, but the sudden rush of feeling made her momentarily breathless. She glanced around, unsure if anyone else felt the same, but the quiet expressions of others assured her she was not alone. The music had moved them collectively, yet privately. The man's own chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the music. He could feel the vulnerability he was expressing, a part of himself he rarely showed to anyone. And yet here it was, poured into sound, received silently, felt deeply by strangers. There was no judgment, no expectation, only presence. He shifted the melody, letting hope enter the spaces left by sadness. The notes began to rise again, gently, carefully, building a sense of forward motion. It was a cautious optimism, a soft reminder that life was still full of possibility, that the past did not define everything, and that beauty could emerge even after long absence or loss. A small gasp came from the crowd as the music carried an unexpected brightness. People glanced at one another, sharing recognition without words. Even those who had been skeptical or preoccupied now found themselves leaning in, drawn by something intangible but undeniable. The man continued, building the melody with patience and care. Each hand moved in harmony, sometimes mirroring, sometimes responding to the other. The flow was natural, instinctive, and unrestrained by technique or expectation. It was not about perfection. It was about connection, feeling, and release. He thought of all the moments he had rushed through, all the things he had missed while chasing the future. He thought of people he had neglected, conversations he had avoided, and experiences he had ignored. The music became his apology, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for the time lost and the feelings unexpressed. A young girl clasped her mother's hand tightly. Feeling the notes in her chest, unsure why they made her heart swell and ache at the same time, the mother smiled softly, sensing the depth of feeling in the music, appreciating its quiet beauty. And allowing herself a brief moment of peace, the pianist began to bring the music to its peak. The notes swelled, carrying the accumulated emotion of memory, longing, hope, and sorrow. They were powerful yet gentle, sweeping through the hall, touching everything in their path. The crowd was silent, fully absorbed, letting the music speak in ways words never could. His hands moved faster now, more confidently, but with careful intention. Each chord resonated with feeling, each pause allowed reflection. The sound seemed to fill the air itself, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and into the hearts of everyone present. And then, in a single, perfect moment, he struck the final sequence of notes. They rang out clearly, fully, and slowly faded, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the music itself. It was not empty. It was full of everything the music had conveyed: emotion, connection, presence, vulnerability, and hope. The crowd remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply breathed, letting the impact of what they had witnessed settle. Eyes met briefly, and faint smiles or tearful glances passed between strangers. The hall had been transformed, if only for a few minutes, into a place where hearts were open and shared. The man leaned back slightly, letting his hands rest on the keys. His chest rose and fell steadily, his breathing calm. He had given himself fully to the music, to the moment, to the strangers gathered around him. And in return, he had received something he had not felt in years: connection, presence, and the quiet affirmation that his own humanity mattered as much as the world he had built. The hall had returned to its normal rhythm. Though the memory of the music lingered in the air like a soft perfume, people had begun to move again, quietly at first, unsure how to step back into the ordinary pace of life. The notes had stopped, but the feeling had not. It clung to the walls, the floor, the people, and somehow it had become part of the day itself. The man at the piano leaned back on the bench, letting his hands rest gently on his knees. His fingers felt tired but alive, as if they had been through a long journey and returned richer for it. He did not speak, did not glance around to see the crowd's reaction. The energy of the moment was still in him, a quiet warmth that spread from chest to fingers to toes. For the first time in years, he felt completely present, fully himself. Without masks or expectations, a woman approached him cautiously, her eyes glistening. She did not know his name. He did not know hers, and yet she felt compelled to speak. That was beautiful," she said softly. "I don't know why, but it touched something I didn't even know was there." He nodded slightly, a faint smile forming, grateful for the acknowledgement but aware that words were unnecessary. The music had already said everything that needed to be said. He simply let her presence exist for a moment before she moved away, returning to her own world, carrying the quiet warmth with her. Nearby, the young boy who had been listening earlier tugged gently at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we come here again tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes bright with wonder. His mother chuckled softly, shaking her head, though her smile carried a similar glow. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe we can." She felt the music lingering in her chest, a subtle reminder of what had been missing from her routine. The man watched them for a moment, recognizing in their small exchange a reflection of the joy he had once found in music. It was not about performance or recognition, not about admiration or applause. It was about connection, about presence, about the small threads that bind people together in ways they rarely notice. A few others began to speak, quietly among themselves, sharing impressions of the melody, the pauses, the feeling. "It felt like he was telling a story," one said. "A story without words, but I understood it," another replied. The conversation was gentle, reflective, almost reverent. The music had created a space where people could feel openly without judgment, and even brief strangers found a shared sense of humanity. The man returned to the piano keys, pressing them lightly, almost absent-mindedly. The notes were soft, barely audible, just enough to feel the connection one last time. He did not need to play for anyone else. He played to remind himself that he was here, alive, capable of creation, capable of emotion. The music reminded him of who he had been and who he still could be. As he played, he thought about the years he had spent prioritizing work, ambition, and responsibility over personal joy. He had measured success in terms of deals closed, profits earned, and recognition received. And yet in those terms, he had often felt empty. The piano reminded him that life's true measure was not in external validation, but in the quiet moments of authenticity. The moments that touched hearts and created memory. He thought about the people who had listened. None of them knew him. They did not know of his life outside this hall, of the responsibilities he carried, of the influence he wielded. And yet, they had responded to him fully, not to the man they thought he was, but to the human being who had allowed himself to feel. That realization was humbling, almost startling. For years, he had believed his identity was tied to power and recognition, yet here, stripped of titles, he had been seen more truly than ever. The man straightened slightly on the bench and closed his eyes. He let the echoes of the music fade fully, feeling their presence inside himself rather than outside. For the first time in decades, he felt free from expectation. The piano had given him a gift he had almost forgotten he needed, the reminder that life could still surprise, that moments of beauty and connection were always possible, and that he was not too old, too busy, or too entrenched to experience them. A soft murmur of thanks drifted from the crowd, though it was gentle, unobtrusive. People were beginning to leave, but their steps were slower, more thoughtful, as if they had been touched and carried a piece of the experience with them. Some exchanged glances, sharing a silent acknowledgement that something remarkable had happened here. Something unplanned and unrepeatable. The man rose from the bench, stretching slightly. His back ached from sitting, but the ache was accompanied by a sense of vitality he had not felt in years. The weight of the piano, the notes, the emotional journey, they all left him feeling lighter somehow, as though some invisible burden had been lifted. He looked around the hall, observing the faces of those who remained. There was no applause, no fanfare, only quiet smiles, softened eyes, and a subtle shift in posture. Each person seemed to carry the residue of the music as if it had brushed against their lives and lingered. That lingering presence, he realized, was the true reward. The music itself had been enough, but the unspoken connection between him and the listeners was the part that would endure. A child who had been hesitant at first approached, holding out a small hand. The man reached down instinctively, allowing the boy to touch the piano gently. "It's beautiful," the child said simply. The man nodded, unable to respond with words that would capture what he felt. He simply smiled, letting the moment exist fully. He wandered slowly toward the exit, taking in the lingering atmosphere. The hall felt different now, somehow softer, lighter, infused with the echoes of shared humanity. Outside, the world continued with its usual noise, rush and demands, but inside him something had shifted irrevocably. He carried with him a sense of purpose he had long neglected, the importance of presence, of beauty, and of allowing oneself to feel fully as he stepped into the open air. The sounds of the city met him with their usual intensity: car horns, footsteps, distant chatterall. The things he had once considered trivial or distracting now seemed vibrant, alive and full of possibility. The music he had played lingered in his mind, not as a memory, but as a part of him. Influencing the way he perceived the world, he paused for a moment, letting the breeze brush against his face, carrying with it the faint echoes of laughter, conversation, and distant melodies. Life had not paused, but he had changed. The piano had reminded him that amidst the chaos and routine, there were still moments of quiet, moments of beauty, moments that could transform both the giver and the receiver. He walked through the streets with a new awareness. People brushed past him, lost in their own worlds, yet he felt connected to them in a subtle way. Each person carried stories, emotions, and struggles, just as he did, and in that awareness, he found a gentle humility. Power, wealth, and recognition were transient, but human connection, even in brief and unexpected ways, was lasting. He thought of returning to the piano again, perhaps the next day or the day after. Not for anyone else, but for himself. It had been a long time since he had done something solely for the sake of feeling alive. The idea made him smile. Life had been so structured, so measured, so predictable. And yet here was a reminder that spontaneity, joy, and emotion were still possible. He remembered the people who had lingered, the young woman, the child, the elderly man, the mother with her daughter. Even though he would likely never see them again, the shared moment had left a trace in all their lives. And that trace, subtle though it was, mattered immensely. For a moment, strangers had become part of each other's worlds, connected by something deeper than conversation or transactions, simply by the experience of music, a feeling of humanity. The man realized that this was what he had been missing all along. Success could bring recognition, influence could bring control, and wealth could bring comfort. But none of it could replicate the quiet, powerful impact of touching someone's heart without expectation. Music had reminded him of that. The experience had reshaped the way he wanted to live. He smiled softly, letting the thought settle. For years he had chased what the world valued, and now he understood the value of what the world rarely noticed: authenticity, presence, empathy, and the courage to be vulnerable. Even in small ways, as he walked away from the hall, he felt a sense of calm, a sense of completeness. The piano, the music, the audience, and the space had given him something he had long sought, but never fully recognized. He carried the experience with him, not as a story to tell, not as a memory to recount, but as a quiet transformation, subtle and lasting. And in the days that followed, he found himself noticing things differently: the pattern of sunlight on a wall, the laughter of a stranger, the rhythm of a child's footsteps, the way a breeze could shift the world for a moment. Each of these small observations felt significant, connected, and alive. The piano had reminded him that life was not just about achieving, producing, or impressing. It was about feeling, connecting, and existing fully in each passing moment. The memory of the public piano moment remained with him, not as a singular achievement, but as a turning point. It reminded him that even in the busiest, most structured life, there was room for beauty, for emotion, and for humanity. It was a reminder that the world could be touched quietly, invisibly, and meaningfully, and that those touches were the moments that truly mattered. And so, he moved forward, carrying the music within him, letting it guide the way he lived, the way he noticed, and the way he connected. The piano had given him more than a melody. It had given him a way to see life itself. It's filled with small, transformative moments that often go unnoticed, yet define the heart of being alive.